Helldivers 2 is a highly acclaimed co-op experience, packing pulse-pounding gameplay against massive AI hordes. But until now, it's been a Sony-centric affair, launching on PS5 and PC early last year. The just-released Xbox port looks to change that though, and it's been handled by acclaimed PC porting powerhouse Nixie Software. Expectations are understandably high here, so let's take a look at the new releases, starting with Series X. Xbox Series X delivers a Helldivers 2 rendition that looks quite unlike its PS5 counterpart. In side-by-side shots in either of the game's two graphical modes, the Series X version looks awfully washed out. Expect irradiated, glowing skies on PS5 in this introductory tutorial area, with Xbox appearing very subdued and grey in comparison. Opening up a Lumiscope in Final Cut provides some key data. Note how the PS5's highlights flirt with pure white, while Series X is held back at about 2/3 the brightness, with the exception of certain bright button icons, which are basically perfectly white. Even though blacks on both consoles are raised, the PS5's much greater luminance range gives the image more contrast and pop, and I think most players will prefer the PS5 output. For this comparison, I've set both consoles to SDR with limited range brightness, with in-game brightness set to the default value. I was able to replicate this issue on both of my Xbox consoles, and people in the DF supported program demonstrated that their consoles have a brightness issue as well. So I do think this is a widespread problem. Adjusting the in-game brightness slider doesn't resolve this issue, elevating darker hues as well as lighter ones. The PC version of the game in my testing doesn't appear to have this problem. In HDR, the game seems overly muted as well, and I tend to prefer the way Helldivers 2 presents in SDR anyways. Outside of their color differences, both PS5 and Series X basically present identically in our test shots. Shadows have similar resolution on both platforms, and have similar cascading as well. LODs for foliage and ground clutter kick in at the same ranges. Textures also appear identical. It's just a wash across the board, though Series X does appear much more washed out. Resolutions are also a match. Performance mode clocks in at 1080p on both platforms, and quality mode measures at a much higher 1728p. Both seem to have the same image treatment too, with an aged-looking TAA in use. Strong signs of FSR1 are present in the quality mode as well, as the technique is likely used to upscale 1728p to a 4K output. Helldivers 2 on Xbox Series X has a fairly similar framerate profile to PS5. In performance mode, we can essentially expect 60fps gameplay at the outset of matches, and in smaller scale engagements at lower difficulties. But when we ramp up the challenge, with difficulties like Impossible and Helldive in the mix, the game seems to hang between 40 and 60fps or so. Dense city maps tend to be the worst offenders, as more wide open and sparsely packed views seem easier on the engine. To really stress the game here, these players carried me through a few hours of demanding gameplay, while I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the action itself, for which I'm grateful. I've got some PS5 capture here for comparison, and the two consoles are substantially similar. PS5 players are probably a little tired of Helldivers' performance at this point, as the game just can't hold a stable 60fps in most game content. Bombed out cities often clock in the 40s, while lighter fare just about hangs in the PS5's VRR window. That's actually a critical detail here, as Series X's wider VRR window and 120Hz output support gives the game VRR playback with low framerate compensation essentially all of the time. Xbox systems are set up to provide a good VRR experience without developer intervention, while PS5 consoles demand developer-side 120Hz and LFC integration, which Helldivers 2 lacks on Sony's consoles, outputting at only 60Hz in all modes. Helldivers 2 also packs the 30fps quality mode on Series X. There's little to note here, except to say that performance is nearly faultless. Frame pacing is even, and any drops are momentary and short-lived. It's very good as far as 30fps operation goes, although this is a game that definitely benefits from a faster refresh. PS5 hits similar headline values, a consistent 30fps with few dips, but it does struggle with frame pacing. Sony's PS5 system is interrupted by periodic bouts of 16, 33, and 50 millisecond frames, despite technically reaching and holding 30fps almost all of the time. This is a long-standing issue that dates back to the game's launch on PS5 consoles a year and a half ago, and it really should be resolved. Helldivers 2 packs another surprise that I think we should take a bit of a detour for. Essentially, on all current-gen consoles, there's a performance monitor selector in the menus, which grants access to a range of information about the game. It's sort of like the metrics available in Doom the Dark Ages on Xbox, or similar statistics that were briefly exposed in the PS5 version of Marvel's Spider-Man 2. This wasn't present in the game for our prior Helldivers 2 coverage, and the earliest evidence I can find suggests it may have been added to the PS5 version in June or somewhat earlier. In its most expansive configuration, we get a range of values for FPS, DRS scale, total frame time on the main thread, the render thread, and the GPU, and a GPU busy statistic. I'm just looking at the Series X version for now. There are a few stats we can dispatch quickly. FPS is basically a slightly more granular, on-average version of what we provide with our own framerate tools. GPU render time, DRS, and GPU busy correlate with each other and tell a simple story. Essentially on Series X, Helldivers 2 is locked to its target resolutions, with a DRS value of 1, so GPU time and GPU busy percentage depend largely on what's in the view frustum for any given frame. GPU busy values can reach very high percentages, and in performance mode, render time sometimes exceeds a 16.67 millisecond target for 60 FPS gameplay. But critically, those GPU render times are usually pretty much fine in performance mode. At worst, only modestly over budget for a 60 FPS target. That's true when the game is hitting 60 FPS, and it's also true when the game is falling into the low 40s. Unfortunately, that's because Helldivers 2 appears to be substantially CPU bound on the consoles, at least when targeting a 60 FPS update. Both the main thread and render thread appear to be bottlenecking Helldivers 2 at different times, suggesting limited multi-threading. The aged and deprecated status of Helldivers' game engine may come into play here. Developer Arrowhead Game Studios built their game around the Autodesk Stingray game engine, which was discontinued mid-development. Optimizing the game for multi-core architectures and making the render pipeline more GPU-driven may have been tall engineering tasks when trying to ship a game with an engine that needs to be maintained in-house. The quality mode is set up a little differently than performance mode. Here, GPU times hang below 33 milliseconds, generally matching or beating the game's new 30 FPS target. Our main thread and render thread sometimes come up to about 25 milliseconds or so, but when aiming for 30 FPS, that isn't to worry at all. Again, DRS scale never drops below 1, suggesting a maxed out resolution around 1728p in all circumstances. Finally, if we take a look at PS5, we find similar results, with close matches in framerate and main thread and render thread time, but there are some issues here. Firstly, there's no DRS value, so we can't tell if the game is dipping below its maximum resolution at any point. Our earlier coverage didn't find resolution drops when we were counting the game out by hand, and given the game's configuration on Series X, I'd expect that's still the case here. Secondly, the GPU frame time section appears to be busted. My best guess is that the new frame time values are being added here instead of clearing the old value or using a range of values to compute and display a synthesized value. Series S, rather predictably, gets a range of cuts relative to PS5 and Series X. Foliage is greatly simplified and doesn't animate. Grasses also appear much less dense, though they do still animate on Series S. Expect to see lower resolution shadows on Series S as well. The cascade lines appear in the same spots as Series X, but the resolutions in each shadow map are lower on the S. There's also some annoying shadow pop-in where rough approximations give way to more detailed silhouettes. Plus, foliage shadows for bushes and trees typically don't animate, and grass is usually unshadowed. We see some small asset differences too, as LODs for distant geometry update more conservatively as we move through the world. Plus, certain textures sometimes don't appear on Series S, and in other cases, higher resolution MIPs stream in somewhat later. I suspect the Series S has a much smaller texture pool than the other consoles, given its smaller RAM allotment, which is causing these delays. Finally, screen space reflections are cut entirely in the Series S performance mode. The game doesn't fall back on cube maps either, giving glossy surfaces a bit of a blank look. There are some indications that indirect diffuse lighting has also been simplified somewhat as well. Image quality is a bit curious. On Series S in performance mode, the resolution in my test shots counts at 1080p, which should be a match for Series X. But actual delivered image quality suffers in comparison, with a jittery appearance around a lot of edges. Plus, textures are blurrier, and in some cases have a slightly blocky look. I suspect Series S is using VRS here, because a lot of this behavior tracks with how VRS often works in other games. The blockiness gets more obvious if we turn off anti-aliasing, like with the detailing on this character's back. But that's not all. In the heat of combat, the Series S in performance mode uses DRS, dynamic resolution scaling, with a minimum value of 0.67. That's the lowest value I managed to reach in intense gameplay, which corresponds to about a 720p internal resolution. Image quality is predictably not great here, and the game tends to look rather muddy during typical gameplay. In performance mode outings, I'd expect to see frame rates hovering around the 40 to 50 FPS mark in more demanding content, gaining 10 FPS or so in lighter missions and difficulties. It's basically the same as the other console platforms, which is no great surprise. You do have to wonder if DRS might have been well suited for the other consoles though, maximizing image quality at any given time depending on the scene. In quality mode, we find a lot of similar compromises. Foliage density is better than performance mode, but still below the Series X quality mode. A slightly higher proportion of that foliage animates, though shadow maps are still generally static. Shadows, again, are better than the Series S performance mode, but lag behind Series X in its quality mode. Screen space reflections do make the cut this time, though they're grainier and look kind of undersampled compared to the X. VRS again makes an appearance on Series S, with some very clear VRS blocks visible when we turn off anti-aliasing. Resolution clocks in at 1440p, which falls somewhat short of the Series X in quality mode. But it's really the VRS that is defining image quality. I'd probably prefer image quality in the other consoles' performance modes here. But in the quality mode, don't expect to see any DRS. Quality shows a flat reading of 1 on the DRS indicator, which suggests a maxed out pixel count at all times. That's pretty odd, given that the Series S quality mode shows clear GPU-limited performance dips in busier moments. I managed to log a steady reading in the mid-20s here, and the game does appear to dip a fair amount in busy levels. It's mostly 30 FPS, but it does drop more often than I expected. The Series S quality mode also has an annoying tendency to crash. Specifically, any time I swapped the performance monitor setting during a match in quality mode, the game crashed to the dashboard in my testing. If at all possible, this should be resolved, or perhaps locked in circumstances where it would cause an issue. The Xbox Series versions of Helldivers 2 are mostly fine. The Series X version corresponds closely to PS5, Series S is cut back but doesn't look offensive, and performance across all console platforms is basically matched. There's little that stands out here as a problem specific to Xbox, except of course the contrasting color issues on both series consoles which need to be resolved soon, and some minor crashing woes on Series S. But Helldivers 2 itself could definitely use some extra engineering effort. The game doesn't support temporal upscalers on any platform, and a technique like FSR3 seems like it would potentially improve anti-aliasing quality and image clarity. Improving the game's CPU-bound frame times is another key cross-platform priority, if at all possible. And the consoles have certain shared characteristics that could be improved as well. Implementing DRS across more console modes seems like potentially an easier win to maximize image quality while keeping frame times in check. The game may be well suited for a 40 FPS mode, given that it often seems to run in the 40 to 50 FPS no man's land in performance mode on the consoles. And 120Hz output with VRR works great on the Xbox machines, but could be added as an option for PlayStation users as well. Of course, all those tasks would require extra time, and it's not clear that original dev Arrowhead, or for the Xbox version, heavily burdened porting house Nixies, has time to tackle these issues, considering their other priorities. In the meantime, Helldivers continues to be an explosive co-op spectacle on all platforms, just one with some lingering technical constraints. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.